Hi everybody, it's Adrian Plass here again.
Yes, and me again.
And just before we say anything else, I think there might be some people who think either our Monet jigsaw doesn't exist or that it's not as formidable as we say it is. So we've taken a photograph of it, and if you look on my website, you'll find the whole thing as it stands at the moment, spread out across the table, and then you'll know just what it is we're taking on.
Well, I'm sure some of you will think if I could just get my hands on that jigsaw, I'd have it done in half an hour. But hopefully some of you will think, oh, rather them than me. We were thinking, today, yesterday, about the things that you can do to say thank you to people. And we thought we'd try and say thank you to the people who collect our bins. So we tagged an envelope saying thank you onto the top of the bin, and in it we just put a bit of money with a little note saying buy yourselves an Easter egg or a beer or whatever on us, and stuck it on the bin with sellotape and went to bed last night because our bins are collect really early in the morning.
What could possibly go wrong? Over the years I've told lots of stories, and people have sometimes said, I like your stories, but they're not true, are they? Well, there may be a little embroidery from time to time, but in the main, they are true. I'll tell you what happened this morning. Early in the morning, Bridget and I were both awake, and we remembered that we'd put this envelope on the bin. So we wondered if the chaps had already come and collected it, or whether they were still on their way. I suddenly heard the lorry coming down the road, so I went over to the window just to look down and watch what was happening, hoping they'd noticed this envelope on the bin. So the lorry comes down, and the fella comes and gets the bins, takes them to the back of the lorry, and then brings them back, pushing them back towards our door with the envelope still on the bin. And clearly he hadn't seen it. Well, I was leaning out of the window holding my Kindle, that my son gave me a while ago, very expensive little piece of kit, and I waved frantically at the chap who was taking the bins, hoping to bring him back so I could tell him about the envelope, and I dropped my Kindle. Now, I dropped the Kindle from a first floor window. It was a very long way down, and I was thinking, that's the end of my Kindle. Thank goodness the Kindle landed right in the middle of one of our plant pots just in front of the house, and I could see it landing really quite gently on the flowers. So I dressed in about 3 seconds, ran down the stairs, ran out of the door, as near as I can run at the moment, and stood there looking up and down the pots, looking for my Kindle. And then along the road comes a man with a little girl. And obviously he was perturbed in two ways. One was that I was there and he couldn't get past and he needed to be 10 feet away or whatever it is. But the other is that I was clearly a loony because I was hunting through the pots. And I said frantically, oh, I've just dropped my Kindle from the window and now I'm looking for it. It landed in a plant pot. And his eyes went very wide, and he clutched his little girl closer to him. And then he said, oh, look, there it is, in the end one. And there it was. It was absolutely unharmed. And so were the dad and his little girl, and they at last were able to go past and remember that I am actually reasonably sane. And I took my Kindle inside, and that was that. But you couldn't write it, could you?
Well, you kind of just have. And yeah, you're quite right. There's many, many more stories that Adrian could tell that are not really very embroidered at all. You know, yesterday we were talking about colours and colours of the day. We had a lovely email this morning from somebody who we know a bit, quite well really, and she's a cellist. And she said she doesn't really see the week in terms of colour, but more in terms of composers, which I thought was absolutely fascinating. Just one or two of them. Monday is Mozart, quite regular and routine, mostly full of pretty little tunes and the occasional devastating aria. Wednesday's Wagner, difficult and goes on forever, which is a little bit like your brown, I think, the same sort of stern
Brown Wednesdays.
colour, Brown Wednesday. My favourite, though, I have to say, was her Friday, which is Scott Joplin. And she said, jigging excitedly along to Saturday. It really was a marvellous thing to start thinking of all the different ways that you can talk about the days of the week. And we had another message from somebody who said he'd always seen things in black and white, but at the moment he's seeing things in grey.
I thought that was an interesting comment, and I'm sure he's not alone in that. It did remind me of a moment when I was down at Scargill House a while ago, and I was chatting to one of the people who worked there, and we were talking about the fact that between black and white there's grey. And I thought, it's not always grey in the middle. And my friend very helpfully said, it could be silver. And I thought that is well worth remembering, that between those extremes of black and white, there can be a rather beautiful silvery thing going on. I'm not sure where we quite go from there, but I find it something that's very useful to me.
Absolutely. I think it took us into thinking about preconceptions and how sometimes we decide, sometimes quite when we're quite young, what something is. We kind of know it. It is black or it is white. I was thinking particularly about my mum. I think we mentioned her and said she really was an amazing woman. But one thing had happened to her when she was a child that she never, ever was able to change her opinion on. She had grown up in a very high church, high Anglican church, and she kind of knew right in the centre of her that the apostolic line was male. So it meant that there was no way, even though she was flexible about all sorts of things, and she genuinely was, there was no way she could budge on the idea that women shouldn't be priests. It got to a point where when she was very ill, and she was very ill just before she died, she came to live and die with us. But before that, she was in hospital. You know what? Her biggest fear wasn't dying. Her biggest fear was what would she say if it was a woman who brought her communion in hospital. Because she couldn't bear the thought of hurting her feelings, but neither could she, in good conscience, take communion from a woman. And it really, really hit me that it's so easy to think, oh, how stupid, obviously something or other. But if there's something black and white right in the centre of you, it is very, very hard to change that. And that applies, I think, to quite a lot of us about Jesus, actually. We have our idea how he is, what he does, what he should do, what he did.
Well, it's obviously the disciples had a very difficult time over this, because we were talking about this earlier, that one minute you have Jesus with the woman taken in adultery. We've always felt sorry for her. When you get to heaven and you say, who are you? And she says, oh, I'm the woman taken in adultery. But
yes.
I was several other things as well, you
and
know.
I did have a name.
She had a name. But with her, there was a very subtle response to the trick they tried to play on him. I won't go into that now, but it was gentle, it was considered, and it was incredibly effective. And then at the temple, shortly after that, and all the money changers and all that stuff, and I don't know, who knows, maybe the disciples said to Jesus, shall we form an encounter group, Lord, so that we can ask these people to come and join us and we can just talk them through to a better perspective. In fact, Jesus said, no, I've got a rope, I'm going to kick them out. That's what I'm going to do. And that's why, you know, for years ago, everyone wore, not everyone, quite a lot of people in the church wore a wristband with WWJD on it, which stood for what would Jesus do? Well, good luck to anybody who is able to know what Jesus would do, because we don't. They didn't, and we don't.
And the interesting thing when we come, and as we said earlier in the week, we're kind of thinking in terms of being in Jerusalem with Jesus. The interesting thing about one or two things that were happening is that it was jostling people's preconceptions. We'd already talked about the fact that he rode into Jerusalem, this great Messiah, this miracle worker, on a little donkey, and that must have started for quite a few people a niggling doubt. Well, then we get him in the temple. And it's easy for us to look at it from our perspective and say, well, of course they will have thought he's absolutely right. He's getting rid of the money changers. He's getting rid of the people who are selling doves and pigeons. But when you start thinking about what do we do when we go on holiday, and the Passover was a huge holiday for loads of people, you would factor that in. You'd kind of think, oh, it's a bit mean that we have to pay temple tax, or it's a bit much that we have to pay for a pigeon or a dove, but you'd probably save up for it. There he is suddenly, this person you thought was going to be one thing. You'd heard the wit, you'd heard the stories, you'd heard of the miracles, or you'd seen them yourself, behaving quite irrationally. And that came to me very clearly a few years ago when I was helping to run a children's club at Easter. And I had the real little ones. And we were watching the film The Miracle Worker, which is a wonderful cartoon, but actually quite heavy when it gets to Holy Week and to the crucifixion. And I saw some of these children when it came to the temple looking really, really worried, especially as they were picking up how cross the Pharisees were with Jesus. So I got them together in a little room on their own, and I said to them, this isn't very easy, is it? Why do you think people were getting so cross with Jesus? Because I was kind of trying to prepare them gently for what was going to happen on Good Friday. And one little girl shot her hand up in the air. She said, because he was very naughty. And I said, oh, really? What do you mean? What did Jesus do that was very naughty? And she said with her eyes wide, she said he was knocking the tables all over. And I suddenly thought that for 5-year-olds to go around bashing things with a rope and knocking tables over and scattering people and shoving them around was very naughty indeed. And you know what? We talk about the crowd turning from Palm Sunday into being the crowd that shouted for Barabbas, but I think doubts would have probably started building in a lot of people's minds.
It's very interesting if you think about the motive for, behind Jesus' action in the temple, apparently attacking stuff and people and creating a terrible scene there. I think a lot of it would be a fury that ordinary people were being denied access to God, to the house of God, as they saw it then, the temple. And it did remind me of a time long ago when I was 6, and I did something naughty, and I was hauled in to see the headmistress, and I was terrified, because she was more powerful than the President of the United States. And I was standing in her room, and she was sitting at the table eating her lunch. She had a bowl of ice cream she was eating. And I looked at her, and she looked at me, and she stood up. Suddenly I went, ah! And she went to the cupboard, got another bowl out, put half her ice cream in it, got a second spoon, and said to me, Adrian, come and have some ice cream. She never mentioned what I'd done, and nor did I. Why did she do that? I think she looked at me and thought, this boy needs ice cream more than punishment. Yeah. A more vivid picture of the grace of God and the easy accessibility of God, I can't imagine. And obviously, I have to add, if I'd done the same thing next week, I might have got a telling off. But that's how unpredictable it is. But for me, that moment has forever been a symbol of grace, and I'm very grateful to it for it.
And I think both Adrian and I have come to realise if we're going to wear wristbands at all, they should have the initials WIJD. What is Jesus doing?
Now there's
today?
A switch for us all, isn't it? Good luck with that. Good luck with that. Bye-bye. Bye.